Okay, guys, the next one we're going to read today from our Progressive Muckrakers is the Triangular Shirtwaist Company Fire Claim 146 Lives. On the most grisly catastrophes ever to befall the American workers occurred at the Triangular Shirtwaist Company, New York City Garment Factory on March 25th, 1911. So turn the page. Trapped in a burning building in which many exit doors had been locked and discourage workers from taking unauthorized breaks, 146 laborers, mostly young women, perished. The resulting outrage encouraged the enactment of more stringent building codes and fed the growing movement for laws regulating working conditions, especially for women. In the account that follows, we're going to read about what conditions led to the loss for the high loss of life, and what could have been remedied, and how much the public outrage about the fire owed to the fact that many dead were young women. So we're going to read, and this is just a timeline of what happened in the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory. So it says, at 4:35 o'clock yesterday afternoon, the fire springing from a source that may never be positively identified was discovered in the rear of the 8th floor, 10-story building in the northwest corner of the Washington Place and Green Street, the first of the 3 floors occupied as a factory of the Triangular Shirtwaist Company. At 11:30 o'clock, Chief Croker made the statement. Everybody has been removed. The number taken out, which includes those who jumped from the windows, is 411. At 2 o'clock in the morning, sorry guys, let me move my... At 2 o'clock in the morning, Chief Croker estimated the total dead as 154. He said further, I expected something of this kind to happen in these so-called fireproof buildings, which are without adequate protection for fire escapes are concerned. Okay, so what we're seeing is this new innovations that are occurring, that like the Titanic, it was supposed to be a ship that wouldn't sink. Well, in the whole age of the Gilded Age, we're going to get new promises that this won't happen. So more than a third of those who lost their lives did so in jumping from the windows. The firemen who answered the first of the 4 alarms turned and found 30 bodies on the pavement at Washington Place and Green Street. Almost all of these were girls, as they were a great majority of them all. The inspection by acting superintendent of buildings will be made the basis for the charge of criminal negligence on the ground that the fireproof doors leading to one of the enclosed tower stairways was locked. Usually they locked the doors because they didn't want these girls taking breaks. It was the most appalling horror since the Slocum disaster in the Iroquois Theater fire in Chicago. Every available ambulance in Manhattan was called upon to cart the dead to the morgue. Bodies charred to unrecognizable blackness or reddened to the sickly hue was to be seen by the shoulders and the limbs protruding from the flame-eaten clothing. Men and women, boys and girls, and the dead that littered the streets. That is the actual condition. The streets were littered. The fire began in the 8th story. The flames licked and shot their way up through the 2 other stories. All 3 floors were occupied by the Triangular Shirtwaist Company. The estimate of the number of employees at work made by Chief Croker was about 1,000. The proprietors of the company said 700 men and girls were in their place. So before the smoke or the flames gave signs from the windows, the loss of life was fully underway. The first signs that the persons were in the street that knew the top stories had turned into red furnaces with human creatures were being caught and incinerated, and was streaming men and women and boys and girls crowded onto the many windows ledges and threw themselves into the streets far below. They jumped with their clothing ablaze. The hair of some of the girls streamed up in a flame as they leaped. Thud after thud sounded on the pavements. It was a ghastly fact that both on Green Street and Washington Place, the sides of the building there grew mounds of dead and dying. So, and the worst horror of us all was the heap of the dead. Now and there, then there was a stir of a limb and the sound of a moan. Within the 3 flaming floors was a frightful. These flames enveloped so that they died instantly. When Fire Chief Croker could make his way into the 3 floors, he found sights that were utterly staggering him, that sent him, a man used to viewing horrors, back down to the street with quivering lips. The floors were black with smoke, and then he saw the smoke drifted and the bodies burned to the bare bones. There were skeletons bending over the sewing machines. The elevator boys saved hundreds. They each made 20 trips from the time of the alarm until 20 minutes later, when they could do no more. Fire was streaming into the shafts, flames biting the cables. They fled for their own lives. Some, about 70, chose successful avenue of escape. They clambered up the ladder to a roof. A few remembered the fire escape. Many of them thought of it, but only as they uttered cries of dismay. Wretchedly inadequate was this fire escape, a long ladder running down into the narrow court, which was smoke-filled and fire raged. One narrow door giving access to a ladder, by the score fought and struggled and breathed the fire, died trying to make the needle-eye road to self-preservation. Shivering at the chasm below, scorched by the fire behind, there were some that were still held positions in the window sills when the first squad of firemen arrived. The nets were spread below with all promptness. Citizens were commandeered into service, as the firemen necessarily gave their attention to the one engine and the hose of the force that had arrived. The catapult force of the bodies gathered in the long plunges made the nets utterly without avail. Screaming girls and men, as they fell, tore the nets from the grasp of the holders, and their bodies struck the sidewalks, and they lay just as they fell. Some of the bodies ripped big holes through the life nets. Concentrated, the fire burned within. The flames caught all the flimsy lace stuff and linens that go into making spring and summer shirtwaists, and fed eagerly upon the rolls of silk. The cutting room was laden with stuff on long tables. The employees were toiling over such materials in the rows and rows of machines. Similarly, the spring day gave aid to the fire. Many of the window panes facing southeast were drawn down. Draughts had full to play. The experts said that the 3 floors each must have become whirlpool of the fire. Whichever way they entrapped the creatures fled, they met a curving sweep of flame. Many soon swooned and died. Others fought their way to the windows, to the elevators, or fell fighting chance for the fire escape. A single fire escape leading into the blind court that would be reached from the upper floors, chambering over the window sill. On the 3 floors, in a narrow window, a crowd met its death trying to get out of the one slender fire escape. It was a fireproof building in which this enormous tragedy occurred. Save for the 3 stories of the blackened windows on the top, you would scarcely have been able to tell there had been a fire to happen. The walls stood firmly. A thin tongue of flame now and then licked around the window sash. So I know y'all are reading off your own copy, but these muckrakers are writing books and people are reading them and they're getting exposed to how labor is not being taken care of, the harsh conditions of the Gilded Age. And this is leading to people saying we need to fix our society. Looking at this, there was only one fire escape. They locked these people in. The workers weren't being respected. And so this is what's going to lead to an era of reform. These muckrakers and their exposés will lead to dramatic departure of the Gilded Age to an era of reform where we're going to have fire codes, building codes. Okay, we're going to read one more and I'm going to stop it here and go to the next reading.